Hans Holbein's painting The Ambassadors is lavish and rich on many levels. Oil paintings, since the dawn of, well, oil paintings, have been a symbol of wealth, something only the very wealthy could commission an artist to make, and to compound that display of wealth, throughout history many wealthy nobles would sit for oil portraits in their finest clothes, in front of their finest treasures, with their expensive, well-groomed pets and their expensive, well-groomed children. In Ways of Seeing, John Berger writes about the ambassadors, "Except for the faces and hands, there is not a surface in this picture which does not make one aware of how it has been elaborately worked over, by weavers, embroiderers, carpet makers, goldsmiths, leather workers, mosaic makers, furriers, tailors, jewelers, and of how this working over and the resulting richness of each surface has been finely worked over and reproduced by Holbein, the painter. And then, on the top layer, above all of this exquisite finery, Holbein just added this weird, shitty smudge that just ruins the whole painting, except, wait a second, if you look at that painting from the right angle, that isn't a shitty smudge, that's a human skull. It was an optical illusion painted with incredible photorealism that can only be perceived by looking at the painting just right. Wow! Good job, Hans, that's sick as hell! This optical illusion obviously requires an incredible level of mastery and study to pull off correctly, and so the technical difficulty of this piece adds ultimately to its splendor and display of finery. These guys had to pay for an artist who could afford to throw in this extravagant extra element that risks ruining the entire piece. The scientific instruments, the lute, the furs, the skull, they're all the same thing. Look how much money I have. And it's also probably no coincidence that if you're seeing the painting at roughly eye level, to appreciate the skull you need to go down to one side and kneel in front of the ambassadors. I know this from seeing the painting in real life. So looking at this painting you can really have two reactions. Simply enjoying the spectacle you could say, yeah, that's pretty fucking Tiger King actually. That's baller as hell. Or considering the extreme, opulent, decadent display of finery, the sheer visual language of money in the portrait, and the culture of inequality, hierarchy, and exploitation that produces a thing like this, not to mention the position of these two men in the society of their time, you might say, what a pair of total dicks. Anyway, let's talk about Zack Snyder. Before we get into Snyder's films, it's important to understand the structure of this analysis. My intention is to examine a pattern of what Snyder does in his films, and then see what messages that sends, what ideology and politics that reflects, and then re-examine his films through the lens of that ideology. My intention is not to go through and nitpick things that I just personally consider bad. I could do that. I could make some insightful observations in a pithy, quippy way, and maybe some bland ones, and maybe one or two that just don't make sense at all, but the format would tell you I was being really insightful and funny. Maybe I'd even ring a little bell like Pavlov conditioning his dog so that you develop a learned response ding to me saying things ding so that you'd laugh every time I ding whether I said anything ding or not. I could also structure this as a long, aimless ramble to the point where sitting down to watch this was a commitment to just switch off your brain and not think too hard about anything I say so that it just slips right by you if I start justifying inhuman cruelty or reactionary politics. But I hope that what I've done here is structure things in a way where people can follow along with the logical construction of what I've said. Zack Snyder's first film, Dawn of the Dead, is an adaptation of George Romero's gentle, soft, comedic zombie movie from 1978, where, for the most part, some characters just kind of hang out around a mall and speculate on the philosophical nature of zombies. The comparison between the original and Snyder's adaptation marks a bigger, general trend that can be boiled down to whether you see zombies as people or not. Zombies in George Romero's Dawn of the Dead are sad, pitiful creatures who shuffle around half remembering their old lives, trapped in a haze of waking death. Sure, they'll eat you, but if you set yourself up so you can avoid them, it's really not that big a deal. And the real threat comes from the gun nerd losers who take joy from the opportunity to be violent. When the bikers show up in Romero's Dawn of the Dead and start killing zombies as sport, you realize both how mostly harmless the zombies actually are, and also instantly how much these guys suck total ass. What a load of piss, you say, watching Tom Savini. That Tom Savini needs to get a new hobby. The thing about viewing zombies as people who something terrible and tragic has happened to, something that could happen to you too, is that this way zombies, whatever they represent, consumerism, disease, consumerism, technology, consumerism, or mindless consumerism, it's a sad thing. Sad for them. Oh no, poor zombie. No. The thing about the shift to seeing zombies as less than human is that now these disgusting things are a faceless horde of monstrous ghouls. They look like you, but have no agency, so they'd be better off if you just shot them dead. See, these human beings who no longer have the ability to take responsibility for their actions and decisions are disgusting, subhuman monsters. And furthermore, the human survivors in these stories who try and take care of one another and maintain a model of society where we inherently owe things to one another get punished by this same morality. I should fess up here that I'm repeating a lot of points made by Matthew, the quickest and strongest of my children, in a video called Who Ruined Zombies that he made on the channel Scaredy Cats. It's really good and you should watch it. Romero's Dawn of the Dead isn't the only important Dawn of the Dead to which it's worth comparing Snyder's though, because the screenplay, originally by James Gunn, was rewritten multiple times, and seeing the differences between the screenplay and Snyder's film is especially interesting, knowing these are changes that can be largely attributed directly to our boy Zirk. It's a good example of something that will be really useful going forwards. All of Snyder's works are adaptations of one sort or another, so it's the things that get changed in the final product that are usually the most telling. Like, for example, the James Gunn script is much more comedic and light in tone, drawing out humor from the grim situation.
Get back!
Jesus, just tell me what's going on!
I told you to get back.
Whereas the final film, as is apparently Snyder's wont, is just shockingly humorless. The shot of Muslims praying with a horror sting over it, implying Islam has something to do with the zombies. That's not in Gunn's script. The fundamentalist teacher telling the audience directly that the zombies are God's punishment for gays, premarital sex, and abortions. Not in Gunn's script. This bit where one character spitefully tells another how everyone he knows is dead.
Dude, everybody's dead, okay? Your mom's dead. Your brother's dead. That fat chick at Dairy Queen. Dead.
Not exactly in Gunn's script. It was originally from a scene where Anna and her romantic interest go on a walk around the mall and look at posters in a shop, and they sort of darkly laugh at how all the celebrities they know are dead, and it cheers them up a bit. It goes something more like, Morrissey, dead. Carrot Top, dead. Smash Mouth, all fucking dead. There's the famous part of the original Dawn of the Dead where the characters speculate on how the zombies are returning to the mall because they remember shopping from their mortal life.
Why do they come here?
Some kind of instinct, memory of what they used to do. This was an important place in their lives.
In Gunn's script, it's a pretty funny exchange. The mall was the most important place in their lives. The only place where they were happy. Doing the only thing that made them happy. If that was you down there, Terry, you'd be jerking off. I would. So it keeps the original poignant observation, but breaks the tension with a joke, as to not feel overly serious. Whereas in the final film, it's just not there.
Maybe they're coming for us.
There's also the bit just before the title sequence, which isn't in the script, where Anna pulls in on the highway behind a bus, and there are two figures with a third who is being held down, and they're struggling as outside the bus, a dazed-looking naked woman walks away from them. We know what's going on here. Obviously these are zombies, but Anna doesn't know yet, and we are invited to see things from her perspective, and through that perspective, this looks like a gang rape. It really plays into the reinterpreting of zombies as a faceless horde of subhuman people coming to destroy your way of life, instead of a population overtaken by disease. I'd really not labor this point too much if it weren't for how much rape comes up in Snyder's films. There's rape or implied rape, or this rape fake out, in all his movies except the animated children's owl film he did and the two Superman movies, where it would be pretty jarring. Crucially, it's focused on in 300 Rise of an Empire as one of the reasons to fear and oppose the Persians. In one stroke, Snyder will make all of his villains rapists so that you can't disagree with the points of his film, because that would mean agreeing with the rapists. And in another stroke, he'll take source material that already contains sexual assault, like Watchmen, and completely reframe the scene to sexualize the victim. The original book doesn't do this. It shows the scene as a relentlessly terrible experience that happens as Sally is trying to just get on with her life. Snyder's Watchmen has, to put it simply, a camera that is interested in seeing Sally's body, and as such that shifts the viewer's perspective from Sally, whose memory this scene is actually supposed to be more sympathetic with Eddie. Eddie is sexualizing Sally when she's just trying to live. We shouldn't be doing the same. Watchmen all over the place actually is a fascinating place to see how Snyder adapts stories to shift them to his worldview. The simple reason that scene, for example, with Eddie and Sally is the way it is that Snyder's Watchmen is way more sympathetic to the comedian than the book is. From his death scene showdown to the riot set to disco music, the comedian is set up in the film as a classic anti-hero, whereas in the book his edgy nihilism is just a limp excuse for his blatantly fascist ideals. In the film, instead, he's a dangerous bad boy who sees through it all with the wrong methods but the right ideas. In the book, old retired man Eddie Blake just gets straight up murdered, pretty much exactly as you might expect, but in the film it's this needless action scene where he gets to fight back and show off how tough he still is. He punches a hole clean through a wall, and then when he is defeated, he gets to laugh it all off.
It's a joke. It's all a joke.
Because of course in Snyder's version of the story, he can't be a sad, scared old man unable to defend himself. No, he has to be a nihilist, rational big boy. Speaking of death scenes, another scene in Watchmen serves as an absolutely mesmerizing study of how Snyder can adapt comic books incredibly faithfully, almost down to a shot-for-panel adaptation, and still create totally different meaning in a scene. In the book, this scene of an old helpless man getting jumped by gang members and murdered is intercut with panels of his old exploit as a hero. The third-person perspective lets us compare the glory days of Night Owl with the old man unable to defend himself now. That's sad, and it's a little scary, and maybe you're also thinking about how these vigilantes are just perpetuating a cycle of violence rather than making anybody safer, especially since it's the new Night Owl's actions that led to this retribution by the gang. In Snyder's Watchmen, there are some notable differences right off the bat. For example, there's a musical score. That's something the comic book couldn't have had. The scene also uses first-person perspective to compare the gang kids to Night Owl's old nemesis. And in this scene, he gets a couple of punches in and holds his own a while before being overwhelmed. This shifts the tone of the scene really dramatically while still keeping mostly visually faithful. It becomes a celebration, a last hurrah. This story that is so much about characters who are flawed and corrupt and weak loses a lot in translation when every character gets an equal amount of ass-kissing hero worship. But really nothing affects the movie as much as the reframing of Rorschach as a cool, edgy anti-hero. It's worth saying again, Rorschach is a bad dude. You're not supposed to like Rorschach. He's a cringe weirdo who writes angry scribbles about how unfair everything is in his diary. He says out loud, in words,
"You might as well call me a Nazi."
He defends the comedian being a rapist like it's no big deal. What a weird coincidence that the movie treats Rorschach like he's right too.
I wanted to make this like, yeah, this is what Batman would be in the real world. But I had forgotten that actually, to a lot of comic fans, that smelling, not having a girlfriend, these are actually kind of heroic. So actually, sort of, Rorschach became the most popular character in Watchmen. I meant him to be a bad example, but I have people come up to me in the street saying, I am Rorschach, that is my story. And I'll be thinking, yeah, great, can you just keep away from me? Never come anywhere near me as long as I live?
It's pretty laughably wrong to make this guy your gruff, tough voice of the night.
Slept all day. Awoken at 4:37. Landlady complaining about the smell. She has 5 children, all by different fathers. I am sure she cheats on welfare.
What a cool guy. It was something often said that Watchmen was unadaptable, that it could never be made into a movie or a TV show, and maybe there's something to that, but if there was one single thing not to do, it would be to make Rorschach cool. We'll get into it more later, but Snyder's Watchmen almost perfectly inverts the the meaning of the original story, which, as I've been saying, is a pretty good lesson in how an adaptation is so much more about what the person adapting it wants to be than what the source material is. And I bring this up because when I try to talk about 300, this is one of the two most common arguments I hear. It's an adaptation of a comic by Frank Miller, so all of the absurd hyper-fascist elements of the movie have nothing to do with Zack Snyder. To be clear, Frank Miller absolutely is a great big fascist. The dude sucks. But Zack Snyder's a huge fan of his work. That's why he keeps adapting his comics into movies. The other argument I hear all the time is that because the story in 300 is being told by a Spartan to other Spartans, it is diegetically fascist propaganda, so the whole thing is satirical. Jesus Christ, this argument. My upcoming movie about how Man of Steel fans eat donkey shit is narrated by a Zack Snyder hater, so you see, you can't criticize it. It is satire. This is such a bad take, it's gonna take some deep digging to fully go over why it's wrong, honestly. For one thing, we should look at things like the homophobia in the film. When Leonidas calls the Athenians boy lovers, he's referring to a sexual practice that was completely normal across all of ancient Greece, including Sparta. Things like that can't be seen as anything but this story's own homophobia. And that's a pretty good microcosm of all the various bullshit that 300 does that doesn't fit in with this satire narrative. God, it's just so hard to explain. It's like, nah, I'm just kidding, it's easy. The American military screened 300 for troops going into Iraq to hype them up into an East versus West red mist bloodlust, because they understood what the movie is about perfectly well. Stop fucking kidding yourself. 300 is a grim experience, honestly. It's grey and boring and relies on Islamophobic tropes of the faceless horde of Eastern monster men, the barbarians at the gates. It relies on the terror and threat of being assimilated into the faceless masses, because the faceless masses are subhuman creatures who would be better off dead. Does that sound familiar at all? Because I don't think I can make it any more obvious that this is Dawn of the Dead. Snyder tends to have characters who get to be characters and then unknown faceless mass villains. It comes back again and again and again, the fear of losing agency and becoming one of the aimless, submissive creatures of the Horde. When I first heard that the Wonder Woman sequel was going to be set in the 80s, I thought, fuck yeah, rollerblades and bubblegum, disco and a perm, this is gonna be sick as hell. And then I heard it was WW84, like 1984, like the story that American children are incorrectly taught is about communism, and then I quietly and sadly put my Wonder Woman action figure back in her packaging. Are we really gonna get Diana Prince defending Reagan's America from the Red Menace? Can't she just go back to her traditional roots of being a thinly veiled BDSM dom? Before we move on, no discussion of 300 should really go by without mentioning the significance of the Battle of Thermopylae has in the history of racism. Even though it was a relatively inconsequential battle, and the far more important battle was the Battle of Salamis, which is easy to remember because salamis are Who fucking wrote this shit? It has been told and retold as a story of martyrdom in protecting something nebulously called the West from something nebulously called the East. The story of 300 Spartans really took off in popularity with white Europeans in concert with the increasing antagonism towards Islam and the Middle East, portraying Leonidas and pals as martyrs and naturally therefore insisting that his army was as small as possible, insisting the Persian force they held off was as large as possible, and that the effects of holding them off were crucial, where actually, the Persians just breezed through after that and burned Athens to the ground. It was again the battle at Salamis that made Xerxes turn back, and absolutely most vitally, the Spartans actually allied with the Persians against the Athenians not that long after, because the petty squabbles within the region were infinitely more important to the people alive at the time than some notion of fragile white women who need to be protected from the barbarians. That's all Nazi shit that was tacked on later. And I mean Nazi shit, like the actual Nazis loved Sparta. They modeled their economy, iconography, and even racial underclass slave state on things the Spartans did. None of this focus is to call Zack Snyder a white supremacist. It's just important to understand the context that this story carries with it, and the white supremacist baggage that it has, and to some degree, the fascist propagandistic ideals that were being revived by this movie in the wake of 9/11. Again, the US Army showed this film to troops to hype them up about killing brown people. But here's the thing. For Dawn of the Dead, you could argue that it mostly comes down to tropes of 2000s era horror, which was pretty shit. For Watchmen, you could say it's that the book is about a set of superheroes who all suck and aren't supposed to be liked or admired, and Snyder just thought they were all really cool. For 300, as pierce an excuse as I find this to be, yes, you can say that it's Frank Miller's story primarily. But when we get to Superman, everyone knows who Superman is. Everyone knows what he stands for, how he behaves, what he does. Superman saves the cat. Maggie, the smartest and most cunning of all my children, is making a wonderful Zack Snyder series, and you should check it all out, but most relevant here is the first episode, Superman Saves the Cat. Superman is the guy who is so upset by one person dying that he makes time turn backwards. We all know who Superman is, and this character Snyder gives us in Man of Steel, simply put, isn't Superman. This is something else. He spends the whole film deliberating over whether or not he owes it to people to save them. In the sequel, he violently threatens Batman and Lex Luthor. Superman and Zod tear Metropolis apart, killing thousands upon thousands of people before Superman takes the now meaningless step of killing Zod. Maybe you don't have a sense for what story Snyder is trying to tell in Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman, but I think intuitively you get that it isn't a Superman story. I have to make it clear here, obviously telling a different kind of Superman story isn't inherently wrong, and I'm sure if I liked the story Snyder had told, the fact that it upset traditional fans would have only made me like it more. This is art! You just don't get it! Eat shit, Clive! But at the end of the day, Man of Steel is where we get down to the bedrock, the real crucial, unavoidable sin of Snyder's films, because you can twist characters to suit a different ideology, you can throw in all the edgy tough boys you want, you can indulge in pointless, tedious spectacle, but nothing redeems your movie if your movie is just boring. This is why when I talk to people about Snyder I get such a mixed response. When I talk about how he perverts source material to make them gain sinister or shitty messages, or sometimes just to mean nothing at all, people tell me that they still find Watchmen or Dawn of the Dead or Sucker Punch fun. But Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman are just piss. The characters are dull, the action drags in a directionless, tedious way reminiscent of childhood play. Just baby Zack smashing his Superman doll and Zod doll together over and over while making skyscraper collapse, thousands of people die sound effects. And the direction seems to have been seriously limiting the performances too. In The Witcher, Henry Cavill plays a far more upbeat and charming protagonist and really gives a glimpse of what a good, simple, corny, wholesome Superman he could have played, but under Snyder's direction he's a scowling, brooding, grim Superman. Jonathan Kent, of course, is usually the moral center of a Superman story, giving us direct thesis statements on how the Man of Steel should appear and behave and what he should strive towards. But in this movie, he tells teenage Clark Kent that maybe he should have let a bus full of children drown? That's not okay, don't tell your son that, what's wrong with you? His basic problem with Clark using his powers for good seems to be that if he tells people, then they will expect things from him. Then, before the issue of saving people versus selfishness can be resolved, Clark Kent insists on letting him die in a hurricane, in honestly a pointless display, because we all know there are a million ways Superman could sort out this situation without letting other people know about his powers. But what matters here is the argument. Clark's dad is telling him no and insisting that he let him die, and in doing that he's having the final word. He kills himself to win an argument with his son. I'm sorry, but that's abuse. That's literally abuse. That's so fucked. I actually get quite upset thinking about what Snyder did to Superman. I love Christopher Reeve's Superman. I don't think it's without flaws, I don't think the original character or stories are perfect, but I love them. And I actually find Batman vs Superman and Man of Steel stomach-churningly horrible. Even alongside the weird racism of 300, the edgy nihilism of Dawn of the Dead, the misguided attempt at feminism in Sucker Punch. For that matter, all the sexual assault too, the reversal of Watchmen completely and utterly. I still find Snyder's Superman films really upsetting, because this Superman is just so deeply deeply wrong. Why would Snyder make a Superman who demands adoration and fealty from the people he saves? Why would he think any of the heroes in Watchmen are meant to be cool or even likable? Why would he adapt 300, this fascist propaganda story that pretends this slave-owning king is somehow a defender of freedom? Because he's an Ayn Rand libertarian.
All right, man, this should go without saying. It should, but unfortunately...
I have a feeling I know how this answer is going to be. Should someone have to have a government-issued license to drive a car?
Absolutely not.
What about the roads? You must drive on the roads. You must hate the roads. You're not fooling a libertarian by bringing up them bitch-ass roads.
The license to drive? You know, I'd like to see some competency exhibited by people before they drive.
Of all the things that could stop libertarians, which tend to be smarter people.
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
A car is like a gun or anything else. As long as you're using it right and not using it to hurt other people, you should have a right to use it.
Mr. McAfee.
Let the smart people kind of figure that shit out and allocate those resources. But I promise you, homies, you're not fooling now libertarian by bringing up them bitch-ass roads. Fuck them hoe-ass roads, man.
Zack Snyder has wanted to adapt The Fountainhead for a long time. He co-founded a production company with his wife called The Stone Quarry, named for a Fountainhead reference, and he's worked a whole bunch with Atlas Entertainment, named for an Atlas Shrugged reference. It's been sitting in his upcoming projects queue for years and years, with him saying that it's really important to him, that he wants to get it just right, that it's his dream project, and that
people will think it's hardcore right-wing propaganda, but I don't view it like that.
Wait, no, hang on. What? Okay, we're gonna have to rewind a bit. Actually, we're gonna have to rewind about 80 years. The Fountainhead was written by Ayn Rand in 1943 and tells the story of an architect called Howard Rourke, who is simply too much of a rugged individualist to bow down before anyone else's demands or expectations. It's nominally a philosophical text, meant to espouse Ayn Rand's personal philosophy, objectivism. In The Fountainhead, Howard Rourke is a student who is expelled by the architecture school because his design teacher feels so personally threatened by his big, muscular brain. People automatically react to seeing Rourke with disgust and discomfort. He doesn't respect tradition or authority or establishment, only talent and raw, throbbing, veiny power. He works for a while in architecture, gets done over dirty by the subhuman creeps who don't believe the same things as Ayn Rand does, winds up working in a quarry, meets Ayn Rand, builds a cool building, but then dynamites the building as an act of petty, spiteful, pathetic protest after being asked to change his plans slightly. He's called into court for this action, but gives a speech so good that they let him off for his crimes because they decided his crimes were just morally justified. So if you want the quite short version of objectivism, it's summarized by a pledge that one of Ayn Rand's most famous characters swears.
I swear by my life and my love of it, that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine.
Or, if you want it even shorter,
in society we don't owe anything to one another, and acting like we do is harmful.
Or even shorter,
greed is good.
Making statements like this sounds very reductive, but I hope I can show clearly that having read a fair amount of Rand's work at this point, I am representing her philosophy accurately and as she would have liked it described. This is just where we run into our first big hurdle. Ayn Rand's work reads like satire. While herself being an aspiring philosopher, her first book was titled Who Needs Philosophy Anyway?, in which she rejects almost all previous philosophers' work. Rand has said that her intention in writing The Fountainhead was to depict the ideal man. Howard Rourke, this rude, arrogant, shitty, entitled, uncompromising jerk, is, according to Ayn Rand, the ideal man. This ties into the fact that Rand refused to acknowledge any philosophers that came after Aristotle, and Aristotle and pals were big into virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a branch of moral philosophy that seeks to discover the principles or virtues that the ideal person would live by, and by which everyone should live to create the ideal society. This will matter later. Please hold this carefully in your hands like a baby bird. This is why characters react with automatic discomfort and dislike upon seeing Rourke. They just aren't ready for how cool he is. But again, this reads like satire. He's simply a horrible person who everyone hates. The writing and therefore core ideology of Rand's stories is deeply inhuman, primarily because she claims to champion objective facts over trivial, silly feelings. Oh gosh, I feel like I know that from somewhere. But at the same time, her characters are deeply emotional. As such, they just seem completely alienated from their own feelings and unable to understand why and how they feel things. Again, it reads like satire. The most beautiful and charming of all my children, Big Joel, made a video about Ben Shapiro, and most specifically, Ben Shapiro's opposition to John Lennon's Imagine.
If I were making a movie where Ben Shapiro is the bad guy, I couldn't do a better job of it than this scene does. Because everything about it tells us that John Lennon is winning.
But I'm not the only one.
That's the problem. He's not the only one.
I hope someday you'll join us. And the world will be.
And in a big way, that's Ayn Rand's writing. So when I say that her philosophy is greed is good, I'm being sincere, and it comes back to virtue ethics. Rand believes the greatest virtues are self-interest, productivity, and rationality, or what she calls rationality, but is more pointedly just ignoring other people's feelings. Virtue ethics, but the virtue is greed. But if we're going to understand objectivism, we're going to need to go straight to the source and talk about Rand's greatest, here meaning physically largest, work, her magnum opus, the complete depiction of the ideal man reshaping society in his image. We need to talk about bum, 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 bum. Atlas Shrugged, later adapted into seminal TV series Kiss Him Not Me, is primarily about railroad heiress Dagny Taggart and her harem of boyfriends, Francisco d'Anconia, Henry Reardon, no, not Howard Rourke, Henry Reardon, and John Galt. Howard Rourke, Henry Reardon, is so clearly named after the protagonist of a previous book, and acts so much like him it's beyond farce. He even pulls the exact same stunt of making a speech to the court about how his crimes should be legal because the law is immoral, and they let him off because his big powerful brain is just too masculine for them. The footage here is from the Atlas Shrugged movies, by the way. They split the book into 3 films, and because it was such a catastrophic piece of shit, they had to recast every character between parts 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, which is why it's so visually confusing. I'm very sorry. Also, part 3 was actually crowdfunded because it was losing so much money. I might do a Patreon only video about this, honestly, because what? Dagny Taggart is every shitty boss you've ever had combined, possessed by the ghost of Margaret Thatcher. She's introduced into the book pulling rank on a train engineer and forcing him to ignore a stop signal, saying that she'll take responsibility if there's an accident, where his refusal to ignore the stop signal is painted as weak and morally bankrupt because it could cause a horrible catastrophe. The train could run late. The book takes place in a world overrun by bureaucratic altruism, where every government of the world is rapidly falling to socialism and America is the last free capitalist state. The American government in the book is crumbling under the weight of completely nonsensical regulations. For example, regulating that Reardon can only make as much of his special metal as other metallurgists would be capable of making if he were to give them the secret sauce recipe. This is, of course, a fucking gibberish bullshit law that no government would pass, as are the rest of the laws in the book. I'm sure libertarians would tell me this isn't unrealistic and governments would do this, but I'm afraid we're just going to have to differ here. Objectivists, one might assume, would be more interested in a book like Das Kapital, which begins with 50 pages of maths, which is pretty dang objective, but one would be wrong, wouldn't one? Because instead objectivists cling to Atlas Shrugged, a book whose basic premise and plot relies on 4 different miracle inventions. See, to be objective in economics, you have to imagine a fictional metal which is cheaper, stronger, lighter, and more durable than all other metals, so you can accurately, realistically simulate what the economy is like. The basic overview of Atlas Shrugged is that American society is crumbling as CEOs are being forced to make less profits, which is bad for the country because... So these individualist CEOs, it turns out, are disappearing one by one to a small commune they've created, hidden in the mountains behind a hologram cloaking device invented by their leader, John Galt. In this commune, these men, and they are all men, are on strike. They're refusing to give their productivity to society, so instead they've made their own, where, according to Rand's version of virtue ethics, they act primarily based on greed. According to Rand, money isn't just a thing we made up to make bartering easier. Money is necessarily imbued with virtue. When one friend lends another his car to get around in the commune, he charges him a flat rate for using it. Where is all their money coming from if they have seceded from society, you ask? Good question. This is where things get really quite fucked. A character called Ragnar Danaskjold is going to the places where these men used to work and blowing them up with cannons from a warship. This, we are assured, somehow is letting him take back their money from the people who've leached it away from them, and then all their fortunes wait for them in bank accounts, in the commune of course, in gold, the objective currency. The commune is very clearly meant to be a sort of heaven on earth, right? All the good people who have disappeared are there, and they all treat each other in a morally idealistic way, and there's even a big gold reward waiting for Dagny there when she arrives, so it's more about demonstrating the ideal society, but I'd like to take a moment to focus on Danaskjold's piracy. Putting aside how someone makes money from blowing up factories, Danaskjold is intended as a reverse Robin Hood. He robs from the poor to give to the rich. He even points this out explicitly and at length. Danaskjold thinks that Robin Hood is a cultural idea that should be abolished. And what I find even more troubling than all this is the understanding of Marxian economics and tactics that this betrays. Danaskjold is pointedly destroying the means of production. To get really basic here, we all understand that if CEOs went on strike, or just holiday, tomorrow, there are foremen, managers, overseers, and a billion other people who would take care of things if, and this is a big if, the CEOs were doing anything useful in the first place. So to stop that from happening in the book, Rand adds in a character who physically destroys the machinery and equipment used to conduct business. The means of production. This shows how clearly Rand actually gets that the ruling class own the means of production and that's the only thing that gives them power, because if she didn't, then she would be fine just leaving it behind and letting the plebs have it. No, it has to be destroyed for Galt's plan to work. This gets even more sinister when you find out that the book was originally going to be called The Strike. When I think about this, I think about the old Union song line, "Without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel would turn," which highlights that it's all workers' labor and the means of production that make anything happen. Rand clearly gets this, and furthermore, she gets that a workers' strike works because they withhold their labor. So she writes that the rich withhold the means of production because withholding their labor is fucking meaningless. At one point in the book, Dagny tells a train workers' union leader who's concerned about the safety of a line she's built on untested materials that I can drive a train, but your workers can't build a railroad. It's pretty convenient that she has this conversation at this point, you know, and not with the workers who built her railroad for her. This is a crucial feature of the economics of Ayn Rand. It works a lot like Minecraft. The chunk you're in is loaded in and all the interactions have to be accounted for, but as soon as you travel far enough, the chunk behind you despawns and you don't have to think anymore about what's happening there, only concern yourself with the witches and goblins spawning in the next... I haven't played Minecraft in a while, I don't know. It is a world of 1,000 contradictions, and focusing too hard on any of them is just going to make you grow eyes on the inside. You can in many cases very easily debunk the contradictions, lies, and fictions that hold up Rand's world, but the contradictions don't actually matter. This isn't a house of cards, it's an impressionist painting, and pointing out hypocrisy doesn't pull out the bottom card, bringing it all crashing down. It, at best, rubs out a brushstroke. The overall impression is still there. It might even be more apt to say the contradictions are the point, because Atlas Shrugged is a cult text. Earlier this year when I was working on a video about H.P. Lovecraft, I read the entire collected works of H.P. Lovecraft, the audio of that collected works, everything Lovecraft ever published and more is 50 hours long. Atlas Shrugged is 60. The Fountainhead is another 30. The experience of reading these books is the most apt use of the word grueling I could possibly imagine. They are long, they are boring, and they are very, very poorly written in a very specific way. Rand constantly spoon-feeds the reader conclusions about the character's motivations and feelings and parts of her worldview, while pretending that these are subtle things she's alluding to rather than just saying. For instance, a character will look at another, and where you might expect a metaphor, Rand will write,
"He looked at her as if he was feeling sad."
Or,
"She didn't know what this feeling was, like disgust, that she felt looking at the homeless man."
The reader is given the opportunity, if they are the kind of person to do so, to convince themselves that they are drawing conclusions on their own. Then, when she does use metaphor, it's an aimless, long stream of consciousness that barrages the reader with so much nonsense that they have no choice but to live in the moment of what she's saying and simply accept each sentence entirely on its own.
But the stranger was still haunted by a ghost who was herself, and the ghost had a mission to accomplish. She had to learn to understand the things that had destroyed her. She had to know, even though she felt that the headlight was closer and in the moment of knowledge, she would be struck by the wheels.
So combined with how absurdly long these books are, this writing style serves to reprogram the way someone thinks. I mean, that's the explicit intention, but it doesn't do that by laying out philosophically rigorous frameworks. They just make constant allusions and virtue signaling gestures to the notion of objectivity, and then argue everything from emotion. I have a right to this. This is good. This is bad. They can't take my stuff. I earned it. I can see so clearly reading this how this would have worked on me as a 17-year-old. I can so clearly imagine this kid who's good at STEM subjects and thinks that only rational objective facts matter and feelings just get in the way, who's upset that teachers spend more time on struggling students than on them, reading this shit and thinking it explains why they're the smartest person in the fucking world. And look, when I say it's a cult text, I do mean literally. In Harriet's article, I visited the secret lair of the Ayn Rand cult, Ite Meyerson. Oh, hang on a second. Shit. Okay, I just gotta switch off. Pause on, yeah. Explores the history of objectivism and how Rand maintained a literal cult following of businessmen in her social circle. Her followers had to wholly buy into her objectivism, hook, line, and sinker, and would be fully excommunicated if they disagree with her on as small a thing as their taste in art. What the fuck is this, Brian? Doja Cat on your Spotify playlist? Get the fuck out of my house and never speak to me again. The cultish nature of Rand's writing is blindingly apparent once it clicks, from the way it works to condition the reader, to the length, to the frankly most troubling element. In the final chapter of Atlas Shrugged, the protagonist and Rand's self-insert murders someone for not being able to take personal responsibility. The passage says,
"She who would have hesitated to kill an animal did not hesitate."
This is the dark turn at the end of the indoctrination process. Here we can see the lives of people who rely on the social fabric, whose decisions are made with consideration for others in mind. Their lives are worthless and they'd be better off dead. The cult does exist to some degree today, with things like the Ayn Rand Institute, also discussed in the article, but mostly it's dissolved into the economic legacy of right-wing libertarianism. Free markets are good, gun control is bad, abortion is good, but driver's licenses are bad, gay marriage should be allowed, but COVID face masks are literally Hitler. Libertarianism is a bizarre brain fart politically because it acknowledges the need for what you'd call negative freedoms. The government shouldn't stop you from doing things, but refuses to support positive freedoms, society facilitating you doing things. Because of that, it's kind of a pick and mix politics, which is why the Republican Party is very much big government, but leans on libertarian propaganda like "don't tread on me" and anti-gun control, come and take them, and most crucially, insisting that the political spectrum is a straight line from capitalist freedom to authoritarian communist fascism. Pro tip for libertarians watching this, have a little think about those positive freedoms. Like, what good is legal weed unless society facilitates you to have free time to enjoy it? And like, what good is abortion if society doesn't provide it for free to any person who wants one? And eventually you'll find yourself somewhere in the bottom left of the political compass with me and the ladies, and you will have taken too much estradiol valerate to care very much. As much as her fans might not want to label her right or left wing, Rand's writing is inherently reactionary. She constantly espouses an idea of a prelapsarian past where things were good before big government meddling got in the way. In Atlas Shrugged, she constantly refers back to the protagonist's grandfather, Nat Taggart, and how he was able to build a glorious rail empire because nobody was messing with his business. Sure, some people tried to make regulations that would get in the way, but then he just murdered them and everything was fine. Normal, cool, normal guy, Nat Taggart. What's really troubling about Ayn Rand is that while you can't pick up the words of Jim Jones or Charles Manson without any critical lens or context, you can still just buy Atlas Shrugged today, maybe even with a bunch of footnotes and underlined favourite passages if you buy it secondhand. So while Ayn Rand's cult is gone, her cult following still exists in some form. And at this point we need to ask ourselves a crucial question. Can you think of another set of insufferably long media that prizes the aesthetics of intellectualism, that has a cult following of belligerent fans who constantly insist you've misinterpreted the author or taken them out of context, that treats the emotional and the socially conscious as subhuman animals who'd be better off dead, that concerns itself primarily with the modern ideal man or hero? No, not YouTube media criticism. Zack Snyder's movies! In the first trailer for Man of Steel, the first hint of what Snyder's Superman would be, we hear Jor-El speaking to his son.
You will give the people an ideal to strive towards. They will race behind you. They will stumble. They will fall. But in time, they will join you in the sun.
This is laying out almost the perfect mission statement for a Superman movie that embraces virtue ethics. Now, to be clear, Superman has always embraced virtue ethics. Truth, justice, and the American... Truth and justice! Snyder differs from Rand in some crucial ways. Like, he really loves the military and also Jesus. Like, oh boy, can he not get enough of Jesus, and representing Superman as Jesus, and condemning characters for being sinful. It's kind of odd to see Snyder say he doesn't think Ayn Rand is super right-wing, when the key ways he actually differs from her just make him more right-wing and more aligned with the Republican Party. This is a feature of Rand's writing as opposed to her real-life strict cult following. In Atlas Shrugged, all the countries of the world have fallen to socialism, except America. In all her books, there are special chosen people who believe and non-believers who follow false prophets, and frequently her characters use will-to-power justifications, like Dagny Taggart shooting a guy who's in her way because she just deems him unworthy. Her books aren't explicitly nationalist, but if you happen to be an American nationalist, they work very nicely for you. They aren't explicitly fundamentalist Christian, but if you're a fundamentalist Christian, they work very nicely for you. They aren't explicitly fascist, but you get the point. On the other hand, there are just so many places where Snyder's work aligns with Rand to the point that you can view Snyder's films in the Randian tradition. For example, although Ayn Rand supported gay marriage, she was a massive homophobe, and she often queer-coded her villains to let you know who was pathetic and weak or sinister, but at the same time, her stories are all about beautiful, ideal men, and every other character is only there to observe them, so when two of these men come into contact, things get really sus.
And the second moment was when he landed at Francisco's side, held him in his arms, hung swaying together between space and ridge, over the white pit, then gained his footing and pulled him back, and, for an instant, still held the length of Francisco's body against the length of his own. His love, his terror, his relief were in a single sentence.
Be careful, you goddamn fool.
Randy! I'm really tired and I had to change my dress because I was wearing a green one and with the green screen, and now I've had whiskey and it's 11:30. Likewise, Snyder queer codes the Persians in 300 while depicting the Spartans in the most hypercharged homoerotic way possible. He throws in little homophobic jabs throughout his films and changes source material to become more homophobic. Like in Dawn of the Dead, in Gunn's script, the scene of the gay man telling CJ about his feelings was supposed to be a light comedic scene as part of a sequence where the characters all get to know each other, making CJ's homophobia the butt of the joke, and instead is presented in this jarringly humorless way that puts the audience in CJ's shoes. We, just like CJ, are suddenly being subjected to this man's homosexual agenda. Speaking of shockingly humorless, this is another place where Snyder's films are just like Ayn Rand's books. Now, to be clear, I have cried laughing at both, but not for any reason that either author intended. And of course there's the core ideology, the virtues of individualism and selfishness, but moreover the ideology of spite. Snyder's films, just like Rand's stories, exist in Spite World. Don't talk to me about the DC cinematic universe, talk to me about Spite World. Libertarian ideology does allow for some progressive politics, of course. Libertarians are typically in favor of abortion, gay marriage, and legalizing weed, so sometimes you can be pleasantly surprised. You can see this on display in Snyder's misguided attempt at feminism in Sucker Punch, where he, a cis man, tries to reinvent feminism from first principles. That's an Atlas Shrugged reference. My brain just does this now. Kill me! Likewise, Snyder is opposed to drone warfare, which is a subtle thread recurring throughout Batman vs. Superman. The US military tried to drone strike the compound that Lois Lane is in when Superman intervenes, and so through the second act of the movie, the debate around Superman's unilateral military action and government oversight of it is kind of a stand-in for drone warfare. However, for the most part, Spite World is not a fun or positive place, and who represents Spite World better than Rorschach? The original author of Watchmen, Alan Moore, a socialist libertarian, or anarchist for the ladies back home, saw the ranting of objectivist libertarians as pathetic, spiteful garbage with no sensible underpinning ideology. One might argue, correctly. Rorschach is actually a parody of an objectivist superhero written by Steve Ditko, one of the creators of Spider-Man. Mr. A is a noirish detective known for his uncompromising principles and love of the sound of his own voice.
Fools will tell you that it's inhuman to live by black and white principles, but human to accept and practice gray principles. That it is human to be corrupt, to accept and practice injustices, and to hold evil as some kind of good. There is no middle of the road between good and evil. They are not two roads going in the same direction, but opposite roads to different goals.
Fuck them hoe-ass roads!
Your choice of actions will determine in which direction you will lead yourself.
You who claim to believe in the good and willingly commit evil are trying to walk a line between them, but by your actions you confess that you do not.
Jesus Christ, look at that wall of text, it's like a leftist Facebook meme. It shouldn't really take much being in on the joke to get that Rorschach is a shitty guy who you aren't supposed to sympathize with, but unfortunately the core demographic of comic books, edgy teenagers, are notorious for taking away the worst possible message from any given piece of media. Add to that a love of the Fountainhead and we can see what's gone wrong here. Snyder sees Rorschach as a cool guy because in Rand's stories, the cool guys who are right about everything are antagonistic, rude losers who everyone else hates, who constantly rant on in long diatribes about how wrong everyone else is. Rand's philosophy is beyond parody, and as such, Rorschach is the Chad of Spite World. He roams the streets looking for an excuse to violently punish people he sees as to blame for everything wrong, and when he finds them he says,
"Sometimes the night is generous to me. Becky wouldn't go on a date with me, but she'll be sorry when I'm rich and famous and she's fat."
Watchmen and Snyder's Superman films represent two sides of the same coin when viewing his work in the Randian tradition, and the reason Watchmen doesn't feel so intuitively wrong to as many people is that Watchmen was already originally a cynical and pessimistic social critique, so Snyder's recuperation of it into Spite World doesn't actually feel so out of place. The analysis of what's wrong in society doesn't necessarily differ that much, except in the subtle places where it's the exact opposite, but who cares about that, right? Superhero goes swoosh swoosh punchy punch. On the other hand, the story of Superman is a beacon of hope. It's the prescriptive ideal of how we should be. In the model of virtue ethics, Superman is the virtuous man, and by acting like him, we can improve society and also live our best lives. However, in Spite World, the virtues that Superman evokes aren't truth and justice. They're individualism and selfishness. In the first act of Man of Steel, Clark goes around working various blue-collar jobs so the audience can all get off to the virtue of hard work, and in the meantime we learn his origin story primarily through flashbacks. For example, Jonathan Kent telling Clark that he should have let children die, and Jonathan Kent forcing Clark to let him die. Of his two dads, Jonathan Kent comes to represent the rational self-interest strain, how you don't owe anything to anyone else. He's trying to stop Clark from accepting the weight of the world on his shoulders, as if Clark is like Atlas, and he wants him to Jor-El, Superman's other dad, gets represented as an action hero, where traditionally he's been a scientist and aristocrat. Snyder constructs Krypton as a Brave New World-esque society, with everyone genetically engineered for their societal roles, which is par for the course for Snyder's anti-authoritarian thing, and again is cool, more or less. He rebels against this by having Superman's mum be the first Kryptonian to have given birth naturally in generations, which isn't really where the focus should be. Women avoiding childbirth isn't the problem on Krypton, is it? The problem is the authoritarian eugenics regime, surely? But alongside Superman being shrouded in Christian imagery, this reads as a morally superior naturalistic correction. It's Lara reclaiming the original sin of birth, which was God's punishment to Eve for taking the fruit from the Garden of Eden. Gotta love getting a good dose of Jesus juice in your superhero movie. Another thing that's strange on Krypton is the need to represent Jor-El as an action hero. Why do we need his dad to be an action hero? Why do we need his family to be special? It feels like a need to prove Superman comes from a good bloodline, which you would think, in a setup that's anti-eugenics, is counterproductive. The last thing about Snyder's Krypton is that while Jor-El is a frustrated climate scientist trying to warn the ignorant elites about their imminent doom, Zod is also trying to prevent the doom of Krypton. This is another crucial feature of Spite World, actually. Rather than coming up with villains who have conflicting interests or motivations, both Rand and Snyder tend to write heroes and villains who want exactly the same stuff. That's part of why both the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged end with the throbbing brain genius character making a speech so good that all of his enemies just give in. Why bother imagining another position when all your characters can just share one? You see this in Batman vs Superman too. BVS is somewhat based on Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, where Batman is just a reactionary fascist. Cool! In The Dark Knight Returns, Batman is an underground freedom fighter rebelling against the tyranny of the state, where Superman is the stooge of collectivism. But Snyder had already spent a whole film setting up Superman as a freedom-loving individualist, so what to do? Make Batman a collectivist? Maybe give him an army of Robins? No, instead Batman and Superman are just the same guy, and Batman essentially hates Superman because he's jealous. Furthermore, it should be noted that while those are Batman's implicit motivations, those are Lex Luthor's explicit motivations. Batman, powerful individualist obsessed with gaining more power to protect the Earth from threats. Superman, powerful individualist obsessed with maintaining his power so he can protect the Earth from threats. And Lex Luthor, powerful individualist obsessed with gaining more power so he can protect the Earth from threats, are all the same guy, albeit operating on different levels of unhinged power trip and with opposing ideas of who the threat is. By the way, if you've noticed here that I'm not really talking about Justice League, I feel like it's worth taking just a second to acknowledge why. After watching and rewatching Snyder's filmography with an eye to understanding their ideological drive, I do now see how much of the theatrical release of Justice League is clearly not a Zack Snyder movie. I'm not trying to give free license to entitled fans who've been demanding a Snyder cut, but I do want to say I can understand why people who like Snyder's films would hate the theatrical cut so much. Again, I'm not trying to say the Snyder cut will be good, but the theatrical cut is bad specifically in the places where it is noticeably not a Snyder movie. Also, you know, the Snyder cut will be really funny, because it will be complete raw piss. 300 is an interesting case because the original comic, also by Frank Miller, is retelling the story of Leonidas as fascist propaganda. It's all about East versus West. Now, that isn't absent from Snyder's film, and it can't be said enough. This film was used to hype up American troops about killing brown people. A friend of mine even told me the recruiter who recruited her was in a command that called themselves the 300, and they had this logo with a little Spartan helmet on, and only the... I swear to God, these guys just need to suck a dick and calm down. However, Snyder's film is more philosophically about freedom, because the story of Leonidas is a cultural touchstone that both fascists and libertarians adore. Fascists for the racism, libertarians for the anti-authoritarian, anti-imperialist messaging and also the racism. To a libertarian, the threat of the Persians is the idea of assimilation into the horde, loss of agency and individuality. Human beings who no longer have the ability to take responsibility for their actions and decisions are disgusting, subhuman monsters. We see this come up again and again with Snyder. Lobotomies in Sucker Punch, zombies in Dawn of the Dead, moon hypnotism in Owls of Ga'Hoole. It's a pretty common trope in Hollywood, but Zack really likes it.
The thing about this idea is that it isn't quite what it seems. Because the answer isn't for everyone to become self-directed individualists, because in society, people often just need things. So the fear of assimilation is actually a fear of being ruled over. It's the fear of becoming a dependent, abstracted by pretending that the powerful don't deliberately create that dependency. When your worldview fundamentally rests on an idea of the conqueror and the conquered, the free and the enslaved, you can't conceive of surrendering some of your power without becoming lower in that hierarchy.
It's kind of a reflexive metaphor that Snyder and others would retell the story of Leonidas while leaving out the Spartan slave state. While slavery existed in different forms all over the ancient world, the Spartans were quite uniquely inhuman to their neighbours. Under Sparta, the Messenians were born into slavery and usually died enslaved, and it was legal for Spartans to just kill any Messenian they encountered. This was the society that afforded Sparta the privileges of rigorous warrior training and let them focus on building up their brand image, which still lasts today. So Snyder and others represent these people as great lovers of freedom and handily leave out the people they were directly oppressing most, because to acknowledge that hierarchy exists at all would shatter the whole illusion.
There's a contradiction at the centre of Rand's work that will never be addressed, which is that the rich own the world and can do anything, but also the world sucks. And to any rational, logical person, the answer here is that the rich shouldn't own the world. But Rand can never acknowledge or address this contradiction. And also, she just doesn't care. Because what matters to her more is that the powerless and the poor resent the rich. It's not enough to be the most powerful man in the world, and it's not enough to be able to decide who lives and who dies. They have to love you too. And they have to love you for your power over them.
After all, as she demonstrates in her stories, the rich and powerful could choose to completely secede from society. They're wealthy enough to live out their lives without the consequences of society at all. But crucially, if they did that, they'd need to know society missed them, and if it didn't, they would have to make it miss them by force.
And this is the root of the objectivist ideology laid bare. It's a world based on spite.
In one truly striking scene in Atlas Shrugged, Hank Rearden's baby brother Philip, who Hank paid to put through college, is complaining at the dinner table because his college education has given him disgusting socialist morals, and now he resents Henry's wealth hoarding. So Rearden turns on Philip and kicks him out on the street.
Now, I'm not going to get into the moral calculus of being an ungrateful houseguest versus making your brother homeless, because this situation was invented by an author, Ayn Rand.
She constructed this situation, and the reason this scene is so striking to me is that it really speaks to the deep emotional truth of the entire hateful book. This is a philosophy that refuses to acknowledge any wrongdoing on the part of the powerful and demands adoration from the powerless, and furthermore, it actively fantasizes about an opportunity to cut off the powerless and force them to suffer without the support they need.
First you make them depend on you, then you resent their dependence, then you resent their resentment, then you fantasize about the day they'll commit a worthy transgression so you can cut them off completely. This is the ideology of the abusive parent. Say that to me again, you little shit, and you'll be out on the street. One day I'll just leave, then we'll see how you will fend for yourselves.
But of course, Ayn Rand's magnum opus has to rely on science fiction inventions, because in the real world, Superman doesn't exist. Nobody who has people depending on them is in that situation because they're actually so special. Either the dependents simply need support, like the elderly, the disabled, or children, or their dependents were forced into this situation by the same system that gives them power. Either way, the dependents have no choice here, and you can't expect to be powerful, loved, and get to decide who lives and who dies. In society, we fundamentally owe things to one another. If you have an immense amount of power and you want an easy way to be loved, there is one. And there's even a great movie you can watch to teach you all about it. It's called Superman by Richard Donner. In the real world, though, Superman doesn't exist, and the people like Ayn Rand, who fantasize gleefully about their opportunity to cut off support to the powerless, are nothing like him. To put it all really simply, Zack Snyder's superhero movies are so fucked because this isn't his Superman. This is.
And all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us." And I'll whisper, "No."
Thank you all so much for watching my first Patreon goal reward video. I'd like to thank Molly Noyes, who made the incredible music, including this cover of Goodbye Mr. A, sung by Natalie, and I'd like to thank Andy Birt for doing the title and thumbnail art for this video. I'd also like to thank my patrons who make this all possible, and you, the viewer, for watching all the way to the end. The next video after this is going to be an analysis of the game Cloudpunk, which you can see early by giving me $2, or more than $2, on patreon.com/CurioVids. As I said, this was a Patreon reward video for hitting $1,500 pledged, and while I was getting this ready, I hit my next goal, so I already owe everyone another video, which I'm working on with Sarah Zedek. It's called The Matrix Sequels Are Good, Actually, and it'll be out, eventually. Just like this one, it will be up a whole month in advance for patrons, so there's another good reason to go and subscribe, even besides helping me just buy delicious food and maybe a pair of tabby boots, so why not? Sure. I also stream on Twitch a few times a week at twitch.tv/TheyMaSophie and make excellent posts 24/7 on Twitter at TheyMaSophie. Thanks again, everybody. Bye for now.
But you knew too much.